Thank you. What a joy to be here with you all. I am thankful to the Veritas Forum, to the Department of Philosophy, and to all who have hosted me so kindly here in my trip to Tennessee. This is my first visit to Knoxville, although I was in Tennessee once before. You are the land of salamanders and caves, and what a pleasure to be here with you. Our topic is faith, hope, love, and climate change, and I have been struggling to come up with a single topic sentence that would describe what I want to say about that, and have not been able to do so. But let's reorder that a little bit and make a couple of comments about climate change, and then my own journey as a person, both of faith and as a scientist, and then a few ideas just to open the conversation with John Nolt. In September of 2014, I was marching with 350,000 people in the center of Manhattan, where the tromping of feet shook the ground as we walked in the People's Climate March. I was in a unit, one of 6 major units, that was many blocks long, and that unit was comprised of faith communities and scientists. I walked with this banner. They let me walk with them, although I did not qualify as young. But these young evangelicals for climate action, they let me walk next to them along with the Christian Reformed Church Office of Social Justice and students from various Christian colleges. Ahead of us was the banner for the Harvard Divinity School, and behind us were other faith communities. But right next to me was an entire group of scientists wearing lab coats and marching under a banner that said, "The data are in." And I thought, I am home. I am home. These are my people, both of these groups. And that has been my journey. Now, let me say a little bit about why climate change can call 350,000 people to march at the opening of UN Climate Week. And I'm going to tell you right now that if you wonder if it's all a crock, it is not a crock, but I don't have the time to explain all of that to you. But this group is really good. The National Academies of Sciences, they have a whole website, and they have put out these very, very useful documents called Climate Change Evidence and Causes and Climate Change Evidence, Impacts, and Choices, and I would point you toward them. I would also point you toward NASA's wonderful interactive website, and this is just one of their views that you could see if you went there, telling you what the current state of carbon dioxide, global temperature, and ice is. This rotates through so you can see other topics as well, and if you went farther down on their webpage, they would also say, what are the evidences and what are the impacts? Well, just to summarize some of those evidences very, very quickly, this is from a 2009 report by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, in their State of the Climate report. And this one graphic puts it right out there for you. It shows 7 things we expect to rise if climate is changing, and they are rising. And it shows 3 things we expect ought to be decreasing if climate is changing, and voila, they are decreasing. So right there, we could take every single one of them, parse it out, and ask, how do we actually know this? But you know what? We're going to move on, because I only have a few minutes. So let me just say, if you've got further questions about the actual science, we could entertain them a little bit later. But I'm an aquatic ecologist. I am not actually a climate scientist. And in fact, from my bio, you might have gathered that I don't do a great deal of actual original research in the sciences, in part because I spend a lot of time loving people and talking about hard conversations. And because of that, I talk a lot about the science, and that's really my role. Nonetheless, I am an aquatic ecologist. So I just want to say that climate change is in a matrix of this concept that there are boundaries to our planet. That idea of planetary boundaries, that phrase was first used by Rockstrom et al. In a 2009 paper in which they describe 9 different planetary processes that humans are changing. And for each one, they try to figure out how much have humans done and what are the potential boundaries beyond which we would hit a tipping point. And how are we doing? And this graphic shows what the top science estimates are for our impacts on the global world. So one of the things I want you to walk away from is climate change is big. It is potentially very scary, but it's not the only thing happening in the world at the same time. And in fact, some of the solutions for climate change solve other problems we are also causing. And that is, we need to be looking for joint solutions that solve multiple problems at the same time. So, why does climate change matter? Well, I'm not going to spell it out entirely because I know John Nolt is going to talk about some of that as well. But this is, again, back to NASA, 3 quick pictures of what they describe. Rise in fires, in droughts and floods, in major storms potentially. But you know, everybody cares about the place they live. So let's talk about Tennessee for a while. You have those 129 freshwater mussels. You've got those 320 species of fish. You've got more crayfish species than I can shake a stick at, and 56 types of salamanders. I have died and gone to heaven, I think, because I'm an aquatic ecologist. So this is my kind of place. And they live here because of a mixture of going up those mountains, finding all those little niches, living in tiny headwater streams. The diversification evolutionarily is amazing here. Climate change will change that some. But maybe if you were expecting me to say it's going to go to hell in a handbasket in Tennessee tomorrow, This is what is likely to affect forests and agriculture, public health, think Lyme disease or Zika virus, or who knows what's going to be moving up your way. And I do know you've got more than 150 miles of rivers and streams that are closed to public use because of bacteria. And that will certainly increase with an increase in temperature. But also, most of the water precipitation, which is expected to come to Tennessee, that's going to increase, that will come during the winter and not during the summer when agriculture needs it, which means you are likely to see both an increase in floods and an increase in drought. And how that will play out isn't really clear. And then some of you, any hunters in here? This isn't probably a giant hunting crew, but those of you who go out and want to hunt for waterfowl, they will be heavily impacted by their breeding and feeding sites up in that prairie pothole wetland in the Midwest and up in Canada. And those sites are likely to lead to a dramatic loss of waterfowl. But I mentioned that Tennessee isn't going to be the first place to feel the effects. So most people feel regional. But you know what? We have to look at the world to see the biggest effects. And this just came out on March 1st. This is from NASA as well, where newest research says that a drought in the eastern Mediterranean is the worst of the past 900 years. And some of you know that a study came out in the fall that directly said that very large droughts in Syria directly helped contribute to the conflicts there and have led to those large numbers of refugees. So, climate change is real. There's a lot of information about it. It will have local effects. It will have worldwide effects. And we're going to move on. Let me just make a couple of comments about my own faith journey. I grew up in Pennsylvania, so that's a beautiful picture of Pennsylvania, near where I grew up, and I love the outdoors. I have a passionate love of the world, the natural world, and of people, and of God. My parents are Christians, and I was taught from a young age that part of being a Christian was to care about the natural world. And probably the most important portion of my own upbringing within the Christian tradition was attending Mennonite schools. Now, Mennonites are from the Anabaptist tradition. If you're not familiar with them, they're a pacifist group. And I was taught from a young age that you eat low on the food chain so you can feed more people with the same resources, that care of other people requires a protection of the environment and is a part of peacemaking, that seeking justice for others is a part of living out your faith. When I went away to college, I had a giant crisis in which I wondered, can I be a scientist and a Christian? And I wondered, how can I be a person of faith in a world that is as broken as this? I saw the history of brutality, human to human, and my heart was broken. And I saw the history of brutality, human to the natural world, and my heart was rebroken. And sometimes my heart is still broken. But in that period of time, which was quite extensive and very painful, I ended up coming back to the person of Jesus. And I looked at the words of Jesus, and Jesus was calling for humans to behave in a way that was upside down to the way I see the world work. But it resonated with me as the right way. I saw Jesus call people to be unselfish, to care about the poor, to not be all about themselves. And I saw commands that if we actually did that, it would be a better world. And it was so compelling to me that I said, okay, I'm choosing this again, and we're walking forward. And that's been where I am. Now, I have only a few more minutes, so I want to make sure I actually talk about the main ideas of this. The phrase, faith, hope, and love, comes from a part of the Bible. It's in a book called 1 Corinthians and a chapter called 13, which is the one everybody says at weddings, the love chapter. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. See, that was my imitation of a minister at a wedding. Okay. But the greatest of these is love. And I believe that. And in fact, my own view of how faith, hope, and love relate to climate change is that I have a faith. It causes me to love. And that love is then going to drive and empower hope. So let's watch that. In December of 2011, I was able to be the lead author on a document put out by the National Association of Evangelicals called Loving the Least of These, Addressing a Changing Environment. The goal of this was to make a case to people who were not thinking about climate change that, in fact, you could not possibly love your neighbor, and you certainly couldn't take care of the poor if you didn't think that climate change mattered. In this, we argued that poor people cannot afford mitigation, that poor people cannot afford the cost of adaptation, that they are more likely to be affected by conflict and more likely to end up being environmental refugees. That is, all of the teachings of Christ that say you need to take care of the poor, you could not be done if you didn't care about climate change. That came out very shortly after a significant event in 2010, which was a worldwide congress called the Lausanne Movement that met in Cape Town, South Africa. The Lausanne movement was started by Billy Graham in the 1970s, and it's only met a few times. But it is a gathering of people with similar faith commitments from across the whole world, in some part of the world, to hash out what does this mean about living in our world today. And this document mattered. They made a document in which they said this: we cannot separate our relationship to Christ from how we act in relationship to the earth. Creation care is a gospel issue. Gospel means the good news, and it's a word that evangelical Christians use a lot. It may be familiar or not to the rest of you. But this actually meant that as an entire globe, people with a similar faith commitment were saying, wow, we have to be on board about taking care of the environment in a way we haven't been so far. Out of that sprang a group that met in 2012 in Jamaica to talk about creation care and what it means for evangelical Christians. And they came up with a whole statement you can find, but they boiled down to two ideas. Creation care is a gospel issue, and we are faced with a crisis that is pressing, urgent, and must be resolved. At the same time that this was happening, the Christian Reformed Church was going through its own thinking process, and they put out a major document on creation care that said similar things. So we have faith, and we have made an argument that to love others, you have to be working out this by taking care of the environment. But where does hope come from? Why do you get up in the morning and have any kind of hope? And I have to go back to 1 Corinthians, which says, love, that's love, bears all things, believes all things, and hopes all things, and endures all things. That is, it is the nature of love to hope. Now, Wendell Berry, the patron saint of many of us who care about the environment, says, be joyful, even though you have considered all the facts. There is a practical side to being hopeful, and that is you can't do anything useful if you're not. So this is another way to say that same thing, and this is from a chapter in a book called Creation Care in the Gospel that is going to come out in just a couple of weeks. And I have a chapter in there too, but I don't even quote my own chapter. Faith, hope, and love are mutually engaging, mutually sustaining, mutually enhancing, and each is necessary for the flourishing of others, says Richard Balcom, author of this chapter. Among other things he says about love, Paul, the apostle, says that believing all things, that it believes all things, and it hopes all things, and is the cause. So Balcom claims that we could divide hope into proximal hope and ultimate hope. For Christians, philosophically, our ultimate hope is in God. But your proximal hope might come from things that are current. And I am going to say some things that make me hopeful. One is just the movement that I see both within the Christian community in which I engage, but also in the world at large. This book by Jonathan Moo and Robert White came out in 2014 called Let Creation Rejoice, and the whole thing is about hope. It's got a whole chapter on climate change, how devastating it is, where we are headed, and how we should be hopeful and also make a difference. I went to a conference in 2014 called Hope in a Time of Crisis, Creation Care and the Mission of the Church. I also, though, have some other proximal moments of hope, and some have to do with the nature of living today. Today, we have a lot of opportunities that were not available to me when I was coming out of college. You couldn't make a nonprofit with $5 and a smartphone, and today, you can. So one of the things that has happened has been people in dire circumstances are innovating wonderfully with small amounts of equipment. And this is a woman doing so. Some of you may have seen things like this, Leader of Light program. How many of you have heard of this? Yeah, super cool, very innovative. I have another version of a talk which I have like 15 slides like this. All sorts of things in slums all over the world, in rich places all over the world, all sorts of innovative ideas that people are moving forward with. And I think that energy and drive is very exciting, even at the same time that the issues we face are very concerning. And then finally, I have to say that I am encouraged by some of the other groups working on these things. Sable Institute of Environmental Studies was mentioned. Rosha is a group working on conservation and mobilizing Christians for that. Groups like Christians for the Mountains that work here in Appalachia and others are working in conservation. So I'm going to just leave us with how thrilled I am to be a part of this conversation on faith, hope, and love. I welcome what you have to say, and I'm going to depart.
By the way, those were wonderful remarks. I very much enjoyed what you had to say, and was inspired, in fact, by your words and your emotion. That's great. I've got just a few minutes here, and so what I want to do is several things. One, I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between carbon emissions and climate change, because I don't think the science is very well understood, even by lots of educated people. So I want to say a little bit about that. So my first bit is going to be about science. And then I want to address maybe a little bit about my journey into all this, and then conclude with some brief thoughts about faith, hope, and love, and their relation to my understanding of climate change. So I'm an environmental ethicist. I'm a fairly skeptical guy when it comes to religions, and so I don't profess a particular religion, although I go to a Unitarian church on occasion. A lot of my view of the world is shaped by my understanding of the science, and so I want to talk to you a little bit about what I understand the science to be telling us. So I'll cut right to the chase. Question: how many people are we killing with climate change? Estimates vary. There are a number of studies that have been done on this by such agencies as the World Health Organization, Development Research Associates, Global Humanitarian Forum, and so on. They all range in the hundreds of thousands annually, currently, and the projections are for significant increases over the next few decades. So just last week, the World Health, wasn't last week, it was recently, the World Health Organization came out with an estimate of 250,000 deaths by malnutrition due to climate change in the period between 2030 and 2050, but that's annually, 250,000 annually. An article this week in The Lancet, that 250,000 was by disease, and then the other article I mentioned is in The Lancet, which is a public health and medical journal, and it also said 250,000, but this was in particular from malnutrition. So these are various causes. Development Research Associates projects 700,000 annually by 2030 from all causes, and they looked at a larger range of things, including droughts and extreme weather events and so on. Now, those are annual figures, and we know that climate change doesn't stop in the next couple of decades. Even if we manage to get control of it, it will take us many decades to stabilize the temperature and then start to bring it down, if we do that. So we're looking at significant casualties at least through the end of the century, and that means tens of millions, minimally tens of millions of casualties. That is the cost of fossil fuel. That's the actual cost of fossil fuel in terms of human lives. And Dr. Boorse was talking about the relationship between climate victimization and poverty. About 90% of those will be in impoverished areas, particularly in Africa and in Southeast Asia. That's where the majority of those climate deaths are expected to occur. We in Tennessee, in the United States, where we have a lot of money and a lot of ways to protect ourselves, will not be that badly impacted, although there will be people killed by storms and the spread of tropical diseases and so on. Those casualties are going to take place among the world's poor. So the question is, how long does this go on then? How long do those deaths continue? We talked about the next, say to the end of the century, 2100. They're going to continue that long. Even if we get our act together tomorrow, they're going to continue that long. How long? Well, one of the recent studies, this is Richard Zeeby writing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, 23,000 to 165,000 years. That's the best science we've got. We're talking about hundreds, not just hundreds, we're talking about thousands, not just thousands, but tens of thousands of years of elevated temperatures. We will adapt to the elevated temperatures, okay? Human beings are very resourceful. We will learn to live in a much warmer world. But there will be a price to pay for living in a very much warmer world. The price will be, among other things, military conflict. We had a talk last year. Some of you may have been there at the Baker Center. Retired Marine Corps general, retired British Navy admiral, talking about the military preparations of their nations for the coming climate change. And if anybody here is interested in, is skeptical about climate change, I invite you to read the Pentagon's reports on climate change and the seriousness with which the Pentagon takes this situation. As Dr. Boorse said, we're looking at the potential, not just potential, we're looking at refugees now from Syria being a huge, major problem in Europe, lots of suffering. An event set off in part by climate change, or at least there's a good reason to believe that it has been set off by climate change. I've just talked about human life so far. We could also talk about non-human life. There are quite a few biologists now who are talking about the possibility of a sixth mass extinction. The last mass extinction occurred about 65 million years ago when an asteroid hit the Earth and was accompanied by a lot of volcanic eruptions. That was the event that killed the dinosaurs, so it was a major change in the Earth's biota. And many biologists are beginning to fear that as a result of not only climate change, but habitat destruction and other changes that the Earth that the human race is making on the Earth, we could be precipitating a sixth mass extinction. That will not happen in your lifetime. It'll take a couple of hundred years to occur, but that's faster than historic mass extinctions. And that is something whose effects last not tens of thousands of years, but millions of years. It takes biodiversity millions of years to recover from a mass extinction. So that's the scale of the thing that we're talking about. That's the scale of the effects that we're talking about. That's the seriousness of the issue. So that's the science part. That's what I wanted to get out of the way. Well, no, there's a second part to it. The second part is, what does that have to do with driving our cars? What does that have to do with having lights on? Or running an air conditioner? Well, I invite you to consider two facts. These are very well-established facts. Extremely well-established facts. The first is that the maximum temperature that the Earth will reach due to climate change is directly or almost directly proportional to carbon emissions, to gross carbon emissions. Every bit of carbon we put into the atmosphere has the effect of raising the temperature. You don't believe that? Understand the physics here. Every single carbon molecule that we put into the atmosphere is capable of absorbing infrared radiation, which is radiated back from the surface of the Earth as a result of the sun's warming. That's radiation that would normally escape out into space. That's the Earth's natural cooling system. Every single molecule of carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere can absorb some of that radiation, which is then circulated in the environment as heat. So that means every emission that we make, every carbon emission that we do, every time we burn fossil fuels, we contribute to this. So that's one of the two facts. The other is that harm increases with temperature. Okay? The hotter the Earth gets, the more harm. The more tropical diseases are spread, the greater the intensity of extreme weather events, the greater the droughts, the greater the flooding, the higher the sea level rise, the greater the melting of ice. All those effects increase with temperature increase. Those are indisputable facts. Okay? Now, combine that with the duration. Tens of thousands of years. You're not talking about a harm like somebody shoots a gun and somebody dies. You're not talking about a harm like somebody emits a toxic chemical and people get sick. You're talking about a harm that's caused by the introduction of carbon into the atmosphere, which continues to create new harm each generation, every generation, for an extremely long period of time. These figures don't have to be even very close. If anything approximately like that is true, we're talking about enormous effects from small emissions. Okay? The fossil fuel era is coming to an end within the next couple of centuries. We can't burn much more fossil fuel. We know that. Eventually, we'll run out. If we do that, we're going to raise the Earth's temperature beyond the point of human habitability over most of the Earth. So that's impossible. So in that time, we will have released all that carbon, which will cause the disruption of the Earth for a period of tens of thousands of years, and if we have a mass extinction, millions of years. Okay, so that's the point. That means we got to do everything we can to stop emitting carbon. This is a responsibility for governments. It's a responsibility for corporations, and I think it's a responsibility for you and me. The average American releases, I don't know, I forget the number of tons of carbon into the atmosphere over a lifetime. But it's not an insignificant number if you think about how the effect of that will ramify down tens of thousands of years and all the harms to which that will contribute. So every emission matters. Every emission matters. We got to keep fossil fuels in the ground. We've got to make sure that that carbon is not released. Okay, so just a few brief words on faith, hope, and love. I want to reverse those. I think you did this same thing. You did the opposite order. You started with love, and I'm going to do the same thing. And I thought of this before we talked. So this is not. I'm not like copying, right? It's in my notes, you can see. I want to start out with love because for me, this whole thing began, my involvement with this whole thing began with a lifetime love affair with the natural world. I love the mountains here. I love lakes. I love rivers. I love the ocean. I've always done that from the time I was a little kid. I love being outside. So I love natural life. Maybe sometimes even better than I love people. I mean, you're better with people. Sometimes I get really frustrated with people. I sometimes feel a lot more comfortable in nature. But I love that, and it's that love that keeps me going. I want to protect what of that I can. My faith tends to be empirical in the sense that I have a tremendous sense of the resilience of life. Having understood what I've understood just from science education about what life has undergone in the last 3.5 billion years. We are not going to sterilize the planet. We are not going to destroy the planet. we cannot get rid of life. It will persist. It's persisted under incredibly difficult conditions, much more severe than anything we can throw at it. Life will survive. And that's part of my faith. And it's just grounded in natural history. We know that life can survive incredibly difficult circumstances. The other part of that faith, though, is, so that's, I guess you might even call that belief, rather. I like to make a distinction between belief and faith. I believe that. I believe life will do that. I also believe that humans are going to survive. We're not going to wipe ourselves out. We're really smart. We're really adaptive. Eventually, the human race will go extinct, but it's going to take a long time. It's not going to happen due to climate change. And we could talk about it. If you want, I've got reasons for that, but let's just leave it at that for now. But there's also a faith that's just action, that's just doing something even without the good reason to believe that it's going to make any difference, because somebody needs to be doing something, because it matters what we do. And I don't know where that faith comes from, but I believe that. I believe that we really ought, every one of us, to have the faith to think that we ought to do something, that it will matter what actions we take as individuals. And finally, hope. I've written a lot on this, so I could talk for hours about hope. But the hope comes out of that. As you said, it comes out of love. It comes out of love. You love something, you automatically hope for it. But it also is, I see hope as a fundamental human need. If you're going to live a meaningful life, you have to have hope. Life without hope is a life in despair, and that's not a meaningful human life. So hope is a fundamental human need. And then the question is, how do you get it? This is one thing I learned from John Hardwig over there. John taught me this many years ago. If all you care about is yourself, then when you come to die, everything you care about dies with you. If you care about others, you can still hope. You can still hope. And I call that self-transcendence. A lot of other people call it self-transcendence too. I like the word self-transcendence. And the interesting thing to me is about self-transcendence is the more widely self-transcendent you are capable of being, the more you have to hope for. And the less what happens to you matters. So wide self-transcendence is sustainable self-transcendence. It's self-transcendence that you can carry with you to the end of life. And so then your hope can be in others, not in yourself. And those others don't have to be human. They can be the creatures that live in the Great Smoky Mountains. They can be, as I said in one of my papers, the red-tailed hawks that fly over the hill where I live, that I love. I love those hawks. So for me, hope is self-transcendence. But self-transcendence, if you're going to be a person who cares about others, then you have to do something. Caring is not just something you feel. It's something that's part of your life. It's part of your action. And so caring naturally leads to some kind of action. And that's where I think I'll stop. We can carry that on in the conversation.
Thank you, Dorothy and John. We appreciate your comments and your passion for this topic. I want to, since we're reversing orders up here, let me reverse the order of our conversation from the order that you all talked about these things. And you went from the more practical, what do we need to do, to the more theoretical, was faith, hope, and love. Let's start with faith, hope, and love. And let's talk about, or you could do it, love, faith, and hope. If you want, that's fine. But what I wanted to ask first and just kick things off with is, Dorothy, you're coming from an academic perspective that's informed by your faith. And John, you're coming from an academic perspective that's more secular in nature. And I'd like to hear how your ideas of faith, hope, and love, in whatever order you want to put them in, how they converge, how they're complementary to each other, but also how they're divergent, how they're different from each other. So if we could start there, and we'll go wherever you take us.
You mean between the two of us?
Yes.
So I can say one difference is probably going to be that the notion of a God or of Jesus, a Savior, doesn't fit into my way of thinking about things, certainly not to the degree it does to yours. I'm not a raging atheist, but I guess I'd say I'm an atheist or an agnostic if you have some vague conception of God. But I do have a sense that there's something extraordinary about life itself. And if you think of I don't know if the term spiritual is the right term here, but life itself affects me the way church affects some people, I think. I have religious experiences in nature. I've never had one in a church. And so it does, what I attach that to is not the notion of a God, but the notion of the living world.
I think we would have a lot of similarities. I mean, when you were talking about people have to have hope, there's a practical side to it. And in fact, it's very similar to the practical need to believe that the universe is knowable. I mean, you couldn't get out of bed and choose where to put your feet or whether or not you could put clothing on. I mean, you couldn't do anything if you didn't believe that. So sometimes that belief is really just a practical choice. Well, there's a certain practical choice to hope, even though I think we both would say it comes out of love. Hope is empowered by the fact that you love things. I have had my own transcendent spiritual experiences, and I did credit them to God, but they were with microscopes and they were in wetlands, and there's nothing better than a wetland. I mean, I mean that actually. There's just, so I guess I would say I'm right with you, except I did end up back at God, and I would say one of the parts that we're not disagree, but that we differ on is the God piece. And one of the reasons I just sort of stubbornly keep ending back there is I think this sense of sin. And I think it's because I personally fail to live up to my own deeply held beliefs regularly. And I regularly take the short option, and I regularly do the lazy thing, and I regularly justify myself, and I know you all do too. And I don't scorn you for that, because I'm right in there in the human condition. But that is so consistent with my belief that people are just beautiful and loved and also sinful. But it also means that I don't think there's a technological fix for environmental problems. And I think the problems that we face are in this category of things that Garrett Hardin called problems for which there is no technological solution. And in his famous 1968 essay on the tragedy of the commons, he talks about how you can't techno-fix yourself out of things. One of the things I've seen as a person who cares about the environment is every time we get a new technology that could save energy, instead of saving energy, we actually do more of something. Have you seen that? That should be a problem. That's not what we're trying to do. And I think fundamentally, I just keep coming back to, I too need to believe that our actions matter, and I do. But part of the reason I do is because my entire life view is imbued with a sense that there's an eternal component to the world, and that everything we do matters, everything we do now matters, and that, so, okay, I've said enough on that.
Oh, go ahead. I'm not going to ask all the questions.
Okay.
You can ask other questions.
Well, I had a thought here. It's not necessarily connected with what you just
Okay.
said, but I'll say it anyway. I deal every day with one of the gloomiest outlooks that one could have on life. It's not me. It's that I'm dealing with this idea of climate change, and I think long term. That's part of the work that I do. Is not thinking just for the next 100 years. Let's think about the next 1,000. Let's think about the next 10,000. Looks really bad. I am absolutely convinced that at least the young people here will see great tragedies in their lifetimes. That you'll see lots and lots of death and suffering as a result of what we've done to this planet. But I'm also just as firmly convinced, and here's where the faith lies for me, that just because there are inevitably going to be great tragedies, that doesn't give us any reason to accede to still greater tragedies. We can still do something that's important and it's going to change the course of history for the better. And we can do that individually and it won't do much, or we can do that together and it'll do a lot. And, one of the things that frustrates me more than anything else is the polarization in this nation, particularly between conservatives and liberals, Christians and non-Christians, all these lines that divide us. If we can work together with people with whom we share deep disagreements on common goals that we know are the right goals, that we know are the important goals, we have an opportunity to accomplish a lot pretty quickly. And so even though I think we do disagree about things like God, that needn't keep us from working together and accomplishing great things.
I agree wholeheartedly, and we were saying in our earlier conversation that one of my sort of philosophical commitments is to agree with people when I agree with them and disagree with them when I disagree with them. And that sounds very simple, but it is remarkably difficult to do. And I think it's more difficult in the political climate in America today, increasingly so. And I'm not completely sure I understand why, but very often what happens is you have a group you mostly agree with, and then you admit that you don't agree about one thing, and you get shot out of the group into space. Has that ever happened to you? Yeah, or, anyway, if you've ever seen that happen to somebody. So one of the things that I think is really important is to try and uphold people who live in narrow spaces, who are, or actually cultivate a desire for moderate voices, to support moderate voices and cross-talking voices. So I think we'd really be in agreement on that, and I appreciate this here.
Yeah, and thanks to Julian for making this possible, because this is exactly the sort of thing that needs to happen.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. You alluded to, at least Dorothy primarily did, the conflict, I guess, the struggle we have in this country between science, the idea of science, and also the idea of religious faith. And often there's a tension or even an outright hostility between the two. Could you talk a little about that?
I think it's partly the responsibility and the fault of the scientists and intellectuals, frankly, because we tend to look down our noses at people who don't know the science and who disagree with us and don't listen. And if we're ever going to get some kind of common action, it won't be among everybody, but at least among a large mass of people, we've got to listen to one another. We've got to hear each other. And I think people who feel threatened by science and just close it off, they're not listening. And the scientists are not listening to the concerns of those who feel threatened by science. They feel threatened by these people. So everybody's down in their trenches taking little pot shots at each other. And they have a lot in common if they just come out and talk, in many cases. And listen. Mostly listen.
I was a remarkably shy child, and I was always conflict averse. And then as an adult, I sort of came out of my shell as I unfurled. But I still don't prefer conflict. And I just decided at some point, sort of like a game of whack-a-mole, and there's one thing I'm willing to stand up for, and it's going to be the environment and God. Like that, this is a conversation that should be happening with churches, that people of faith should be included in the conversation with scientists, that we have to care for the environment. This is going to be my one thing I stick my head above. And of course, in your daily life, you do about other things too, and I vote and all that. But I think that sense that we live in a culture that has promoted a conflict model of the way different groups interrelate is so dysfunctional that anything you can do to fight against it is a good thing. And I have to say that some of the time I experience that kind of dysfunction, but actually lots of people don't have a conflict model between science and religious belief for a variety of religions. I mean, and so it's not the only way to view the universe, and it isn't the only way, the only lived experience of people that are scientists and people of faith. And so I guess I would just encourage sort of a broader view that isn't all about conflict.
What do we say to our friends who are people of faith and they don't trust the science? Like maybe they say, oh, well, they used to call it global warming and now they call it climate change. Or they say, they used to say that everybody knows that fat causes heart disease, and now they've changed their mind. So they say there's a fundamental mistrust of science. So they say, this is what you say today, but 5 years from now, how do we know that you'll say the same thing? What do you say to that?
Here's one thing I would say, that when those people are having heart problems, they go to see the doctor, and the doctor relies on science. Now, maybe they're also praying and hoping for a miracle, but they're going to see the doctor. They do believe in science. They just don't want to believe in certain parts of science. And so the question is why? Why do you not want to believe in climate science? You're willing to believe in medical science. You're willing to trust your life to medical science in some cases. Why don't you want to believe in climate science? And there I think we need to listen to the answer, because people are acting out of fear. And those fears need to be addressed before this issue can be dealt with in an effective way. But we got to understand what those fears are and do something to address those fears.
I would say let's just quickly knock that global climate change warming thing out. Warming is the main result from increasing CO2. But it's hard to picture because we talk about it in terms of averages, but the world isn't average. And so the concern is not actually, for the most part, about the warming itself. There is the direct effect of some heat waves, but most of the effects are indirect. So that enormous amount of heat trapped may only average to a degree around the globe, but it actually translates into a much increased evapotranspiration in an area, right? And that's a drought. Or it increases the water cycle and wet areas get wetter. That causes flooding. So because the actual effects were so much more than actual just a temperature, scientists said, people are not getting this, what we're talking about. We're really talking about the climate is changing. And that's been sort of, 20 years people have been using that term to try and get people to get their heads around what we're actually talking about. But to the question about how science changes, this is actually not a small question. This is an enormous question, sort of a paradigmatic shift that has taken 60 years of people studying, and actually our knowledge that this was likely to happen goes back 200 years. So this is more like the development of plate tectonics than it is like, does fat cause heart disease or is it really sugar, right? I mean, we're going to tease those things out, but it's really more like going, does heart disease, cause you to die, or was it something completely unrelated to your heart, right? So for my students, sometimes I try to describe it this way, but you get a little bit of information. It's like a ponceliced painting. And the people that are staring while all this data comes in all over, they start saying, I think an image is forming. And one says, I think it's a cow. And the next one says, I think it's an elephant. And then they duke it out. Is it a cow? Is it an elephant? People are walking. More data, more data, more data. And then something starts to gel. Well, guess what? That first elephant guy was wrong. Everybody says, you're so dumb. And then they, but the rest of the group starts to come in. But then there's people that are not experts, and they're walking around behind, and they're saying, I think it's a squid. And then there's people that are saying, I'm not even looking at the data, I'm just listening. And they're like playing telephone and saying, scientists say this, and it's not even related at all to what the data are showing. But eventually then, the group says, look at these data, they're coming in, I'm seeing a dog, I'm seeing a dog. And then finally there's going to be this one person that is convinced it's an elephant and never is going to change their mind until they die. And was that the wrong thing to say? Sorry about that. That's how people work. Like, there are people that by personality cannot change their minds. And there are people that are running off out the starting gate way too soon. And then there's this massive group of people that are just carefully looking at the information. And they're going to be the people that see it first, right? And if you're like pointed the other direction, you're not going to know. So you have to actually ask them. So did you ask why would you believe science? Was that the thing? Because what are our alternatives? Like voting? I don't know. Like, what are your alternatives to that? Was there more to the question?
No.
Okay.
that was a great answer.
Okay.
I do want to circle back around to dealing with people's fear. What are people of faith afraid of, and what are science people afraid of? What are our fears, and how do we deal with them?
Can I say, are you saying about a relationship of faith and science, or are you talking about climate change?
I'm talking about science and faith right now.
Okay.
And the reason I brought that up is because we've been talking about the science of climate change, climate science.
So I think I won't try to speak for religious people, but for scientists broadly to include intellectuals, what they're afraid of is their academic reputations, among other things. People, it's an in-group like any other in-group, and skepticism is a hallmark of academics, and people don't want to be seen as non-skeptical or worse, credulous. And so they fear too close an association with religion. And it seems pretty straightforward to me, at least for that group.
And let me say, as a scientist, I feel that too. Like, I'm out as a Christian. I teach at a Christian school. However, when I'm with a lot of scientists, sometimes I'm afraid they'll think I'm really stupid. And sometimes that happens. And I think, dang. You know, like there is sort of a, I don't know, a sense that you can't go there, or that you can't cut somebody, or you can't believe that they're as intelligent as you are, if if that's a part of it. But what are people of faith who don't believe science afraid of? As a scientist, that is hard for me to relate to, and it's not something I feel like I could really answer. That's not a part of my faith commitment. But I do know people like that, and I guess sometimes they're afraid of being disrespected. It's probably part of it. Yeah.
Like disrespected by their own faith community?
No, I mean by the world at large. Mm-hmm. That's a part of it. I realize that I am a scientist, so I'm sort of extrapolating from conversations with other people. But.
What can we do about our fear about science or our fear about faith?
Love.
Or should we do anything?
It's love. It's love. That's what you would say too. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. You have to love other people. When you do, you treat them better.
You're bringing people together to talk.
Yeah.
That's how it's done.
It's about respecting other people and whenever you can, supporting moderate voices. I mean, that's got to be, I think we need a great deal more commitment in society to just the goal of civil discourse as a good. So thank you.
Good. Well, both of you started out with a whole lot of passion. That more passion than I was probably expecting. If we can go back there, I want to hear your passion. And I want to hear you talk about moving forward, moving into hope, moving into faith, and being grounded in love. Can we go back there?
Yeah, I'll say something about that. I mean, you all saw that I feel a lot about this issue. It's hard for me to restrain my emotion when I talk about it. This is long-standing with me because, it's grounded. It's grounded, first of all, in that love that I have for nature, and it's grounded in a frustration when I see so much of it being destroyed. This really came to a head for me back in 1985. And my daughter's up there. She knows this. Yeah. That's when she was born. And I began thinking about the world that she would grow up in. No, I didn't. I began being depressed is what it was. I was depressed when she was born, and I didn't understand it. But I came to understand it after a year or two. I understood it wasn't depression, it was anger. So what you see in me is anger. It's really anger, and it's anger at the destruction of life. And when I realized that, I thought, there's something I need to do here. And that something is do the best I can to defend life against that destruction. That's when I became an environmental activist. And I've been doing that for 30 years. It was a funny thing. The minute, I won't say the minute, but as soon as I became an environmental activist, that depression was gone. And that became energy. And the energy is what's carried me. It's carried me for 30 years. That's my passion. That's the source of it.
Thank you.
I'm not sure what to add to that, except that as you cry, I cry too. I mean, I'm absolutely telling the truth when I say I'm very hopeful about many things. But there are things I can't allow myself to think about, or I have to do it in small doses. Elephants, rhinoceroses, my heart almost stops to think about what we've done to grand creatures. And I'm with you on that, exactly. And even though I have a hope, and even though I have a faith in God, I don't think that God will magically step in and save us from screwing up. I don't have a magical thinking that says, even though we don't deserve it, that elephants won't be killed off because someone will stop us. So I have written now 3 times on an environmental science textbook. They come out every 3 years. And environmental science is the only thing I can think of that deserves to come out that frequently because it's out of date by the time you print it. But every time I get to certain places, species loss is one of them. It's like my heart stops and I just have to breathe. I have to take care of myself. And I will say that when in 1985, I was in my own bleak state in college, and that was when I gave up Russian literature. I have to say,
Watch that, Dostoevsky.
There's some moments when
Heavy
you have to
stuff.
take care of yourself. No offense if you're a Russian literature major or something. By which I just say that you somewhat have to protect yourself. You can't, and the way I justify that, at least, is to say no human being can face all of the reality of the brokenness of the world at one time, right? So you can only do one piece, or you can only face one piece. There's no way to access all of that at once and be okay. So it's okay. Permission Fairy says, protect yourself if you have to. But you can't protect yourself by just choosing to be ignorant for life, right? So I think the 2 temptations are to deliberately be willfully ignorant or to despair. And somehow we have to navigate a walkway in between. For me, that walkway has been impossible without a belief in God. And maybe that makes me a weakling, or maybe that makes me wise to the fact that God is. I can't speak to that, but that's where I'm at.
I want you to leave us with what we can do. I mean, John, especially your comments, it's such a huge problem. I mean, you're talking thousands and millions and of years and people, and Dorothy, you were in the same vein, not as much, I guess. And I'm just one person. What can I do? What can we do?
Everybody can burn less carbon. And that's not going to make a huge difference. And that's not going to be enough. And that's not all of what you can do. But you can drive your car less. That's one thing. You can think of other ways to burn less carbon. But it's not going to happen without political action. If you're a student, one of the things you can do is support a divestment campaign to get your university to divest from investments in fossil fuel corporations and to support renewable energy. That is the single most effective thing that can be done at the university level by students to change the economic picture, which will help to transform the climate picture. Get out there and vote. Everybody's got to vote. Vote for people who are going to fix the problem. We're not just going to deny it or argue about it, but who have a plan to work with it. And love. Mm-hmm. Love something. Protect it.
I heartily agree. I think a lot of times when people ask me that question, they want me to list 5 easy steps. Well, if you would just put that recycling in the right place, or if we just didn't have that water bottle. That was a joke.
I laughed.
But it's remarkable how it requires individuals all to believe this and want to change it. Because the people making decisions can't make those decisions if they don't think they're going to have the backing of the constituents, right? So your elected leaders need to know you will back them if they do unpopular things. And unpopular things, it's almost always unpopular to think more than 2 years in advance. So everything that we do that is short-term good and long-term bad, you have to say no to it, and you have to tell your elected representatives to say no to that. But I do agree that it's going to take huge systematic change, and yet it requires a lot of individuals to be a part of that. And so let me give you a couple of hopeful stories of changes that have occurred that I've seen. And this is part of my hope too, is when I came out of college, just like young people today, except there wasn't as many ways to do anything. There weren't as many organizations already working on it. There wasn't as much. And nowadays, there's a lot of people trying, and there's a lot of excitement about things that could be done. There's smart cities, and there's, all sorts of urban and regional planning that's planning for climate change. And there's all sorts of careers in this. And so I just want to be a little bit encouraging that you're not alone if you care about these things, and there's groups trying to work on them. And I know a lot of groups that are Christian that are trying to work on them, but if you're from some other group, go for it. There's all sorts of things going on. So I would not feel like you have to be the only person that cares about this.
Thank you. Let's thank our guests for stimulating the evening. We're going to take a 5-minute break. Some of you are going to need to leave. But if the rest of you would, if you'd come down front, it'll help us have interaction with Dorothy and with John. 5 minutes, and I'll call you back. Forum with John and Dorothy.
Okay.
Well, I'm sure that that interaction stirred up some emotion and thoughts, and at least we hope it did. There may be some people angry. That's okay. That's our purpose, is to come together and to interact with each other in a safe environment, in a civil conversation, even when we have fundamental disagreement. So I'll let you just raise your hand, and John and Dorothy will call on you. And if you would repeat the question. So.
because of something that man did. Man doesn't have that much power. Also, God knows all and is, so if he is in control and he is allowing this, am I making sense of why I think that in my family's case, that would radically change their idea of God, which would which is at the core of their whole social structure.
I'll take that one. I wish your family was here, and I would just love on them and say the following. People's conceptions of God, even within Christian tradition and Jewish tradition and prior to that, have changed quite a bit. In fact, 250 years ago, when they were finding giant bones of dinosaurs, there was a stream of thought that said, these cannot be the remains of creatures that once lived and don't anymore. Because God could not have made species and let them go extinct. That isn't consistent with God. But nobody says that today, right? People take some time to get their heads around reality. When you also believe in God, as I do, you have to get your head around reality and God, right? And so it's a complicated set of thought processes that have to occur. I would probably say God allowed humans to mess up the ozone layer. God allowed humans to do a wild array of other things.
Create the atomic bomb.
Did you miss the atomic bomb? Right. That's. Except I wouldn't be sarcastic. But I would say there have been other things that humans have done that have been on a giant scale. Mercury poisoning, lead poisoning, all sorts of things. And you know what? We do them. And so I think we need to face that we're doing this.
Nolan? Yeah. Nolan.
Right. So just to repeat what you said, when you try to make a place for people to talk about their faith and new ideas that they have not encountered or tried to pull together, you really have to do that in a way that allows them to consider that they're wrong, or that people that they love are wrong, and that maybe at some point they're going to have to openly disagree with them. So when you deal with young people, of course, new ideas and all of this stuff is also compounded with forming an adult relationship with your parents and all of these complexities. So I think the safer you can make that conversation, the better. If you can say, it's okay for you to disagree with me, even though actually I have 30 years of scientific training and you do not, that's fine. Again, I'm never sarcastic when I'm actually in these conversations. Maybe we shouldn't be filming this, I don't know. But anyway, I think that in that moment, sometimes giving people sort of a way of describing for themselves a possible different way of thinking about things, and then allowing people to rest at sort of resting places. People don't go from 0 to 60. Like in biology, as a Christian in biology, we're on the hot seat for everything. Every opinion out there, people think has to do with us. So, just allowing people to be on a journey. People don't get their heads around stuff immediately, and allow them to get to the next place and sort of empower them to think. So if you did think this, what would that do, and how would you communicate that? You said something about the social world, and everybody has a social world, right? So if an atheist was to suddenly change their mind about that, it would rock their world, possibly. Well, it certainly does when a Christian is in an environment where nobody else is thinking something and they have to figure that out. So giving them even resources, and of course I deal with this on a variety of topics, right? But one of the things that's nice is to find resources that people can cling to. And there's been several evangelical Christians who started a new group called Climate Caretakers. You could sign up and they give you a weekly prayer letter about the climate. And sometimes it's got information and something you can do. How lovely. That's making a safe place in the language that people talk.
No.
So I have a kind of a two-pronged question about love, and I say this or ask this question with a full recognition and appreciation for how love can be transformative and what extent it can lead to advancements itself. And even in the primitive way, even for non-humans, like they're analogs to what love is. Okay? And very respectful and impressed by the passion that you guys have displayed both in your work and tonight. I'm very influenced by that, too. By the way, if you haven't read John's book, it's excellent. So,
Thanks for
Which
that
of
plug.
his 7 books is excellent? The others are terrible, but the one is great.
He's sucking up to me. He's sucking up to me because he just turned in his dissertation.
and then the spirit of that, too.
Do you have a question?
My question is, I have a good way to ask it, but then I want to come at it with 2 different ways. And my question ultimately is, what are the limits of love? And thinking about it in 2 different ways. The first is loving life itself. In the full recognition that not just biological evolution, but to some extent cultural evolution, has also advanced through exploitation, appropriation, violence, war, conflict. Many times, things that have had an immense impact later down the road have come to these more morally objectionable phenomena, right? And the second is, how wide does that do we cast that net of self-transcendence to the extent where love becomes vacuous and it loses its personal animus, you might say, as it's related to what we identify with. So that's my question.
I'm going to have you take a
I'll
stab
take
at
that one.
that.
Yeah, he's a philosopher, so.
I could tell.
Yeah. Okay, so self-transcendence doesn't mean self-transcendence toward all living things, because that's humanly impossible, right? I can't be simultaneously self-transcendent towards something and use it as a food item, for example. And I may avoid certain kinds of food because I think it's too much violence, but I can't be self-transcendent toward the bacteria that my body is now killing because I have an immune system. So I don't think it's possible to be self-transcendent toward everything. I don't think it's possible to respect all living things, as some people do. I think it's possible to develop a love for and relationship with lots of living things. And so the kind of self-transcendence that I would advocate is a personal relationship and caring about many things, human and non-human, many people, but also realizing that there are limitations and a kind of theoretical understanding that all life is valuable, but realize that we can't live as individuals without killing things, and we can't. Life cannot exist without the destruction of other life. So that's part of the whole process. So it's not a universal self-transcendence, in my case.
Can I ask you a follow-up question then? And because I read some things that you wrote, and you wrote about sort of a Native American approach to that you described as being sort of descriptive of this self-transcendence. But if I understood the Native American approach to, say, eating food, they thought they were respecting animals and yet using them for food. In other words, maybe that's a different word for respect, but they had a whole set of, some of them at least, had sort of rituals that sort of acknowledged debt to the animal and yet felt free to use them as food. So could you tell me a little bit more about this business where you can't really respect an animal and also use it for food? Is that, how would you differ from what you were describing in the Native American sensibility?
So we have a tradition in Western philosophy that to respect something is to treat it as an end in itself, as a thing with its own purposes and not merely a means. That comes from Immanuel Kant, and that's the concept of respect that I typically use. And when you're eating something, you're treating it as a means. There's a certain point at which I have to disagree with Native American thinkers on this. I had a long conversation at one point with a woman, a Native American, who tells me that the animal that she kills, or the animal that she eats, gives itself to her, and she accepts it gratefully as a gift. And I said, I don't think that's respecting the animal. I can't see that as you can appreciate the fact that you have this food, but the animal would have preferred to live. It didn't give itself to you for food. It would have preferred to live. So that's the point where I come up short there.
Okay, I was curious about that. And I don't have a lot more to add to that, but as an ecologist, I'm really struck by the fact that ecologists think in terms of whole systems. So it's not about really caring about individuals in other species as much, but there's a wholeness to whole systems and soil and even structure of soil. There's a wholeness to a system that I think it isn't the opposite of what you're saying, but it's not the same as what he's saying, that maybe I would have wanted to add. Yeah, okay.
We pointed at different people,
Okay.
I think. So one of you two.
You and then you.
So thinking, going back to the question of the possible conflict between science and faith, and the phenomenon of climate change denial that we currently face in this country by many members of our political establishment. And for me, I guess my question is, to what extent do you think that the climate change phenomenon is not so much a problem of science, climate change denial phenomenon is not so much a problem of science versus faith as is a problem of science versus capitalism and the particular concerns that taking the long view is often very unpopular. But I think then that is compounded within faith communities who see who their motives really lay, whether or not they know it, really lay at base lay with a capitalist framework. They're more concerned about making money. What they label it in terms of my faith tells me that God made the earth 6,000 years ago, and therefore this whole climate change malarkey. So
We got it. Okay. I'll take it, and then he could take it, because I think we are going to agree on this but have slightly different things to say. And I'll just say, absolutely. In fact, the Pew studies on religion that have shown that different groups by religious belief have differing levels of acceptance of the science of climate change have always also shown that it's actually closer tied to political position than it is to religious experience. That is, when the level of religiosity is not as tied, and particular religious positions are not as clearly tied as our other ideological principles. And I think that, coupled with something that you didn't say, but which is the politicization in our country of the topic of climate change, the number of people who very clearly think that Democrats believe that, so I don't, that sort of thinking, and really that with Al Gore being the figurehead early on, that did tremendous damage, I think, to the conversation in our society. And I would just agree that that's a big part of the problem, is the conflation of those issues. But
Yeah, I think the problem is complex, but you're right that capitalism lies at the heart of a good bit of it. There is a deliberate effort to distort climate science on the part of institutions that are funded by fossil fuel corporations. This is well known now. There have been lots of exposés on it. The Heritage Foundation is a major one. We had a couple of folks from the Heritage Foundation, a woman speaker last week from the Heritage Foundation, who came to talk about the dangers of environmentalism on campus. So yeah, really, yeah, yeah, fearsome, aren't we? So there's that, and that is a deliberate attempt and conscious attempt by fossil fuel corporations, ExxonMobil being the worst offender here. It's been ongoing for 30 years to try to distort climate science, and the motive there is clearly money. It's clearly profit. But I think if you look across the spectrum of people who deny climate change, among just the people of America, a lot of them, of course, influenced by that. But for many people, it does stem from a sense like, this shakes my worldview. God couldn't let this happen. And for others, it's a convenient way of defending their lifestyle, which is very closely tied with capitalism, from what they see as big government interference. So there's a wide spectrum here, but certainly capitalism is deeply tied up with it.
no, behind you, and then you.
So I was wondering if you could give us some practical ways on entering in conversations about this topic with people who have vastly different opinions. Because I recently moved here from an area where we got fined if we didn't recycle, and then I moved to Knoxville, where you kind of have to go out of your way to recycle, and even then it's not a very good system. And so I found myself with very different viewpoints from people around me, and several times you said I would be the sarcastic in conversations with people, but what are some practical ways that you found in entering into conversations with people that have vastly different viewpoints than you?
Don't preach. Ask a lot of questions, and try to understand their fear. And then talk with them not about climate change, but about the subject of their fear. A lot of cases, it's big government. They're afraid of big government. A lot of cases, they're afraid that they're going to lose the lifestyle that they've got. They want to keep this way of life, and they're afraid that that'll be taken from them. And then engage them on that. Don't engage them on climate change. Engage them on what they're really afraid of.
Or also engage them on what they want. Almost anybody cares about their children if they have children. and children and grandchildren, they might like animals. I mean, you know, they like something, right? So find something they like. Air. I like air, you know, it should be breathable. Find something that they like. And I think just connecting on that basic human level and then having some piece of information that they don't have. Like, they're complaining in the summer about the heat. Well, guess what, Knoxville? Sorry, but it's going to get worse, right? Or some, whatever. And I think, and then making that little connection, the things we do intentionally add up to this system that works or doesn't work. But the other thing is to call in allies. So you're talking to somebody and they have a different worldview than you do, but there might be somebody out there with the same worldview that holds some social power for them that you could call on. Oh, so, the Dalai Lama wrote about that. Oh, the Pope wrote about that. Oh, John Nolt wrote about that. Yeah. That'll do it, So finding the hook that says, and actually I find remarkably that people don't know. So, I'm from this peace tradition, right? And yet I'll talk to a very conservative person who's like not, and I'll say, do you know what the Pentagon thinks about this? Because the Pentagon holds sway for them, right? And in that we can agree. And so I think finding your allies that would be able to speak the right vocabulary is something that would be helpful. And then you had a question, right? Did you? Yeah.
Actually, to follow up on the capitalist thing. So you talk about it with those who have grown comfortable in the United States and those who have a lot of economic power. But to look at it from kind of a microcosm level, I am a family of oil workers. I am third generation of people who come from Montana and Wyoming who are oil pumpers. They work for Standard Oil, a very large number of my family work for Mexico. And where we're from in Wyoming, a lot of the economy is tied into what we refer to as our natural resources, which almost entirely oil, coal, uranium, and things that are very difficult to the environment. And in terms of climate change particularly, working in the oil industry is difficult. How would an individual or community start to think about extricating themselves from that system when it's literally the only economic option? I come from Wyoming, but in West Virginia, basically coal is king. And I feel like there are a lot of people in my situation who could see the necessity of moving away from those, but at the same time, that's changing their bread line.
Right.
So it's a difficulty.
Right. So your question is, just to review it for the filming, is what about people whose entire communities are based on resource extraction for fossil fuels? And I don't know what you would say, but I think communities like that should be brave enough to call on the rest of the country. It should behoove all of us to be problem solving, right? But if you look at similar situations in the past, many extractive industries are boom and bust industries. Mining is famous for that. And it always ends in this sort of grinding down where people don't know what to do and have to move on. But if you looked at resource extraction, say in the Pacific Northwest with logging and how it ended so abruptly with the spotted owl, but it had been in decline for 30 years and people were in denial of that. Coal is in decline. People are in denial. It is not just this that's causing that. So what would be helpful would be to say, what company is willing to go to West Virginia and make it a hub of some entirely different industry, right? It's a terrible thing to have only one industry.
So, yeah, I think that's right. These are not problems that can be solved quickly.
Right.
But there are a lot of people working up in West Virginia to transform that coal economy into a tourist economy, to make use of the wonderful mountains that they have for recreation and tourism. So that's one place where a lot of that work is being done, and a lot of it's being done by nonprofits, some of it with, I think, some government funding, but not much. So one way to help that situation is for nonprofit organizations, local or from outside, to come in and create green industries, green jobs. I think in Wyoming there's tremendous potential for wind power there.
Yeah.
So you could
And
have
solar.
and solar. Same in West Virginia. Actually, the strip mine hilltops in West Virginia are ideal for wind. So with some government help and with some work by nonprofits, those economies can be transformed, but it's going to take years. It can't be done overnight.
And I think that's another example of something that cannot be done by one person. It requires a decision by a lot of people. We're going to go help economies change and diversify.
These problems are greatest, though, in developing nations. China is the world's largest consumer of coal. India is coming up. Mm-hmm. That's where this kind of thing really has to happen, and it really has to happen fast, because China's now the biggest carbon emitter in the world. India is fast catching up with China, and that has to be reversed. So it's not just here in our states; it's global. I could say just briefly, that's what the climate agreement in Paris was about. A lot of that is technology transfer and assistance from the developed world to places like India and China to transform their economies so that they don't have to rely on coal to the extent that they would otherwise have. The agreement in Paris was too little. It's not going to restrain the emissions to where we can stay under 2 degrees C, probably. But it was a beginning. So there is that. And a thing that very much harkens me is everywhere in the world are people who are working on this issue. Lots of people who are working on this issue. So it's a global effort. Absolutely. China has done in many ways more than the U.S. has. Their coal is peaking right now. They have dropped their consumption of coal. They have an immense solar and wind energy program in China. So they're not going all out and building coal plants like they were. Their consumption of coal looks like it's peaking about now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree with that.
I'm wondering, you guys have talked a lot about your similarities, and I don't want to call them different or anything, but I'm wondering how your different views of origin might affect maybe your view of why we should care about the earth. So as a Christian, I believe God created the earth and said it is good. Therefore, inherently, the creation is good. So would you talk some about maybe how your view of origin, whether creation or Big Bang or whatever, might affect how you think about how should I care, why should I care about the environment? Does that make sense?
I'd be happy to start.
You start. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you repeat the question, though, for that?
Yeah, so the question is, do we differ in the ways our conceptions of the origin of things affect our thinking about the value of life, the importance of life, and the issue of, I guess, of climate change. I don't believe in a divine creation. I don't really have a view about how things got started. I think it was a big bang, but that's, who knows? What you go back far enough, and who knows? We don't really know much. We know a lot, but not the important things about that origin. And the question is, well, what about divine origins? For me, there's something, I don't like to use religious language, but you could say sacred about the evolutionary process. There's something, it's continually throwing up miracles. You just have to walk outside, look at the living things around you. Those are miraculous. I don't think that that's the product of a designer. I think that's a natural process. It's a process, though, that's fabulous. It's absolutely fabulous and beautiful, and also horrifying. So, the origin of it, I don't think makes much of a difference. The fact that this is an ongoing process of life, and it is mysterious, and it's beautiful, and it's creative, is sufficient to want to keep it and preserve it and love it.
Well, I would agree that that's the end point I get to. But I don't know that without God that would be sufficient to love it. And I don't know, but I'm not in that thinking space. Just to go back to your question and just to make a little correction, there isn't, a creation doesn't mean there was no Big Bang. So, I'm with the Big Bang. I guess I would just say, I would reiterate a Christian stewardship ethic, which says, if God likes this and made this, then you are obligated to it. In fact, when I speak in a quiet place with fellow Christians, I will call people on that. Because if you think that God created stuff, then you better think it matters, right? And that actually means things you don't like matter. Like, it's a little edgier than that sounds. It's not just like house cats matter. It's like, ew, maybe things I don't like matter. They still matter. Which actually could, hopefully, have the impact of humbling a person. Like, my own personal take on the value of the world is not actually the point, right? So I would hope that would be the outcome. That would be a sense of humility about it that removes you from being the center of the universe, right? But it's lovely to hear you say there's miracles. I think, and yet you don't really mean that.
I don't mean divine intervention, but I mean something wondrous.
And I think that it's wondrous, and I think it's a natural process, and I think, ooh, that's a super cool natural process God made. So I think we're in sync on that part.
Yeah.
Except for the God part.
Yeah. Which
is pretty big.
And I guess I don't even think this is a disagreement. It just, in my case, I don't feel a need to add that. I think it's sufficient that you got this process of life.
And I hear it, and I'm waiting for you to make the leap to how that gets you to where you ended up, and to me, it's not sufficient.
So I guess what I don't have that you have is God gives you an obligation. I don't have that.
That's right.
I think we give ourselves obligations, and that's harder. That's harder to do.
That's probably true, and lots of people choose not to do it.
Yeah.
You're right. And then I can haul out God, but you can't.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So, and you're right, and I'm at a disadvantage in arguing with those who believe in God that way. But
Of course, it doesn't always work when I do that either. But
yeah,
anyway,
I would like, I mean, I would like for us all to get to the point where we saw the value of life, whether we're believers or non-believers in God. I think that itself would take us a long way to where we need to be.
up in the back. I mean, you, yeah.
Excuse me, I think you mentioned earlier that there are several factors that play into whether or not the person is willing to accept climate change. But as institutions, we've seen a number of Christians and other religions where taxes, patriarch Rome, that's like 2/3 of the Christian world. We've seen a lot of people moving to an acceptance of science, and not only an acceptance, but a call for action, even in more conservative parts of the church. From each one of y'all's perspectives individually, do you feel that the Christian community and the religious community as a larger part of institution-wise is either keeping pace with the general population acceptance of climate change, is it outpacing that, or steadily turning the speed behind it?
All of those, all of the
All
above.
of those, yeah.
Yeah.
The Pew polls are where you would see that, and it really breaks down by groups. Like, for example, Hispanic Catholics and Hispanic Protestants and African American Catholics and Protestants are well ahead of the general public in acceptance of climate change, while white Protestants are generally behind. And most of that is attributed to what that other gentleman was talking about, when you actually also include sort of political ideology, that those differences are accounted for.
I think that the involvement of Christian groups in the broader climate change movement is absolutely essential. And the model of activism that I grew up with was civil rights and peace activism. In those movements, you had civil rights, particularly the black church, but lots of churches got involved, and with various degrees of foot dragging. And in the peace movement, the same thing. There were lots and lots of churches that have been involved in peacemaking work. And without those would not have succeeded. So I see it as very, very important that we have, a broad representation of religious faiths working together with people who they don't necessarily agree with, and with other faiths as well. So Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, everybody.
We have one over here.
Yeah.
whatever living you're living.
Right.
Right. So how do you reach these people? How do you get them to care about nature enough to motivate the kind of action that we want to see?
I think that's a hard group. Oh, he asked, how do you motivate people who don't care about nature? And actually, ecologists have this conversation because almost all the ecologists I know, they're motivated by sheer love. That's why they got into it, sheer love and curiosity. And then they're doing stuff and they think it matters, and then they're encountering people who don't have that sheer love. And Richard Louv, who wrote the book Last Child into the Woods, talks about this. He talks about this generation just having an utterly different upbringing. And I think the global effect of urbanization has been a part of it. So the electronic revolution is a part of it, but also just this dramatic urbanization occurring across the whole world means many, many, many people are in very large cities, and some have very, very little interaction with all the things that we would have grown up with and loved. Which means for me that a lot of my conversation has been about the practical implications for humans. So I can wish that I could motivate you about salamanders till I'm blue in the face, but I might be able to talk about heat waves in cities. And I might be able to talk about sea level rise. And I might be able, and Knoxville isn't the epicenter of difficulty with climate change, right? So you have to get people to visualize and care about Bangladesh with 160 million people in the size of Wisconsin, just above sea level, to be able to get like a real sense of urgency sometimes. But I don't know. What would you say?
I think it's a really tough problem. It's one of the things that depresses me most, actually, about the current younger generation is that's not reality. That's a fiction that people are living in, while reality is being significantly degraded. I think one thing that helps is to as early as possible give kids extensive experience in nature, to get kids out of the urban environment and get them out to farms and to the woods and to the mountains and to the ocean. So that's that, but that's not what you can say to such people.
No.
I guess what I'd say, I don't know. I don't know. But I guess what I'd say is something like, you're missing a lot.
I taught a young woman once who didn't know what moss was. I'm like, really? Whoa. I was stopped in my tracks, and then I took her to an arboretum. So I don't know that informs you at all, but I think we all recognize it, just like, wow. But it's pretty hard to avoid. I'm a parent. I'm raising a 14-year-old who would just think if I would shut up and let him play video games all day, his life would be fabulous, and I'm a terrible person, So.
I have one more question.
Okay, and then you've got a question after that. Okay. Environmental education. Well, I think almost all kids, there's an age, there's like a window when they love to go outside and run around. And if you can get them then, you got them, right? Get them then enough. And years ago, I taught the funnest job I ever had, I think, at a little environmental nature center. And these kids would come, and the first graders always did this bird unit. And I knew if I saw one robin, we were golden. robin. They could see 27 robins every other day of their life, but we were in the woods. We saw a robin. It was like a huge success. And I do think there's that delightful stage where you could get them right then. That's what the best ones do. One thing, we talked a little bit earlier about citizen science at some of these nature centers, and I think the rise of citizen science is really, really cool. And I think a lot of parents would like to be more involved in their children's lives, and offering things for whole families is probably really helpful.
So I don't have a special wisdom on that, I guess, because I've not been involved professionally, at least with the education of young children, although with my own children, yes. And we just spent a lot of time outside in the woods. And that seemed to be okay. Seemed to work all right.
I mean, I am here to say that was extremely effective.
And you had a question.
One more question. And we
So I
need
want to
to-
talk about population. And obviously there are different views on this. Some people don't think that population should be a topic. Population growth specifically. Because it's a very versatile topic. But, and Bill and I actually visited you last semester and talked about this very briefly. There are obviously problems with not talking about population growth. It poses a huge threat to the environment, and yet our planet can't necessarily sustain too many people. So how do you convince people that population is something that one needs to talk about, let alone address it?
So let me take a whack at that. And there's a guy sitting over there that can answer it even better. Trevor's doing his dissertation on the population problem. And he's and rightly so, because for exactly the reason that you suggest. It's taboo in a lot of intellectual discussions even. You don't bring it up. It is the elephant in the room. The Earth has a carrying capacity. We don't know exactly what it is, but we're pressing on it pretty hard. The UN predicts that we're going to reach 10 billion, maybe as high as 12. Is that right, Trevor?
That's a little high.
Yeah.
Thinking.
By the end of the century. The amount of carbon emitted into the atmosphere is the average amount of carbon that an individual emits multiplied by the number of people. There are two factors there. We've only talked about one of the factors. The other is the number of people. The more people we have on the planet now, the fewer people the Earth will have capacity for in the future. And that's the basic paradox. We need to reduce population. That's my view.
I think population is a very big issue because it has the same effect. It's a risk multiplier. So every other problem that you have is just made worse if you have too many people doing the same thing at the same time. And that's resource extraction, and that's pollution, and that's climate as well. And our need to meet the needs of many people at once is going to be compromised by climate change. The piece that I think is really interesting is how rapidly some places have pulled down their fertility rates. Like Iran, very rapidly, Thailand, very rapidly. And the kinds of things that were required to do that were really not just a general increase in economy, but very specific social modernization things. So we know what things will stabilize a population. But what's really striking, I think, is the disparity in resource use. And so when you talk about population, which is naturally falling in many parts of the world because of urbanization, but you're sitting in a place where every member of this room uses like 15 people's worth of stuff for some cultures, it seems disingenuous to the outside world. And so I think that's part of why it's been a taboo, right? So I guess I would just say I do think it needs to be talked about. I have written about it myself. But I don't think it's very simple. And that's in part because the real pressure on the earth right now is not just an actual increase in numbers, but that the average use of resource is rapidly increasing. And that's worldwide, that's rapidly the case.
And I agree with that, but I do think it's both. It's both population increase and
Right.
consumption increase. Population
I
and
agree.
consumption are the two factors. And so, and what that means in practice is that if we in the West, in the developed nations, think that population is a problem, we have to recognize that we're the largest consumers, and so it's our duty to reduce our population far more per number of people per children, per number of children per person, than somebody in Africa, which has actually the most rapidly growing,
Right.
and which it gets to the complication that you were talking about. Because if you say Africa, reduce your population,
And
we're
they're
white,
like
they're black.
really people,
Yeah.
right?
You look pretty white to me. Yeah. Yeah, but we who say this are typically white. You don't hear a lot of people
Well, I
of
think
color
that has
talking
been
about
part
population.
of the difficulty in the human rights discussion.
Yeah.
Well, Dorothy, John, thank you for a stimulating and informative evening.
Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you all. Very good. Yeah.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.